Okay, so you can see by the title and this fabulous image of Sherlock Holmes, I'm going to be talking about fan practices for developing language and literacy. I'm going to focus in particular on fan fiction though, so we're going to get to that. And then there's a workshop afterwards where we're going to get our hands dirty or have a little bit of fun going through a fan fiction archive, identifying fan fiction and using the tools that fans use to find fan fiction for teaching and research. So, first I want to get started with talking about what I mean by fan, because this is a term that has been debated and discussed in the field of fan studies, which is a subfield of media studies. And I like this definition by Duffett, that a fan is a person with a relatively deep, positive emotional conviction about someone or something famous. And I put this up here in part because it's possible to be fans of lots of things. But today, you'll see, I'm talking mainly about what we might consider media fandom, so people who are fans of books, movies, television shows, anime, and manga. You also have fans, we've got Springsteen over here, a photo taken by a fan and fellow colleague. So you could be a fan of a performer, an actor. You have people who are fans of football teams, football players. You even have people who are fans of politicians. So again, the idea is someone, yes. And if later on you want to search for fan fiction about real people, you can try that. So there is real person fan stuff out there. But I'm going to be focusing in particular on media fans. And what I'm going to be talking about is online fandom. So people have been fans of things for a very long time. And you can find fan studies researchers who've gone back and looked at, for example, how people identified as fans in the 1960s towards Star Trek. Going even further back, you might say that a number of people who identify as Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts practice certain kinds of fan behaviors way back when I don't know if you guys know, spoiler, apparently Sherlock Holmes dies at some point. And when Arthur Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes, his fans took to the streets wearing black, protesting because they wanted him back. So that's over 100 years ago now. But I'm going to talk about online fandom. And so these are the local and international networks of fans that develop around a particular program, text, or other media product. And I'm drawing this out to online fandom because the practices that I'm talking about have become a lot more visible for us when they happen online, and they open up new avenues of teaching and research, which is what I'm doing here. I'm also going to talk a little bit about language learning in particular. This is where I'm coming from. And I'm using the term here, call in the digital wilds. I know Steve Thorne was here recently, and he's also well known for the idea of the digital wilds, or what he might be saying is rewilding the classroom, kind of going back into what people are doing in these non-formal spaces, affinity spaces. The definition I'm using is something that Katerina Zero and I have been drawing upon in our special issue, where we're looking at call in the digital wilds. And that's informal language learning that takes place in digital spaces, communities, and networks that are independent of formal instructional contexts. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you are examples of fans who do things, a variety of practices, that results in language and literacy development, but they're doing it of their own free will in these online spaces and communities. And I'm looking at that as inspiration for what we can do when designing materials in the classroom that draws on actual learning practices in the digital wilds. So to start, I'm going to talk about a few fan practices and point to a bit of the research out there. And this is kind of an overview of one of the articles that I sent around, Sauro 2017, which reviewed some of this. So I'll touch on a few points there. But then I'm going to really zero in for the rest of this talk on fan fiction in particular. So we'll talk about anime and manga consumption, fan site web design, debating and modding, amateur translation, spoiling, and fan fiction. These are not the only fan practices out there. There's a lot of other stuff, but this is what I've looked at as far as research that points to language and literacy development. So we're going to start with some older research that looks at anime and manga consumption. And we've seen this coming out of a variety of places. So for example, Fukunaga 2006 was looking at American university students who were studying Japanese. And what we find are there are certain populations in her class that she was looking at, where there were some people who came to study Japanese because they were fans of Japanese media, in particular Japanese anime, or we might say like the animated films and television shows. And what happened was a lot of these fans wanted to have a deeper understanding and appreciation for the things they were fans of, so they started learning Japanese as a result. But what Fukunaga found was this kind of cyclical process wherein anime consumption initially inspired their learning. But because they had a lot of, we might say, familiarity with cultural scripts and certain norms from the Japanese media they consumed, this actually enhanced these students' learning opportunities and deepened their engagement. So for example, what we might find is that they were more familiar with terms of address, both formal and informal, showing relative status between individuals, which they may not have practiced as much in the classroom. Or they were familiar with what we find in certain types of Japanese media are a kind of onomatopoeia, I guess, where sounds are depicted with specific characters or specific hiragana and katakana. And so they came with this knowledge already of certain Japanese words based on their media consumption. So it kind of deepened their knowledge and appreciation. So their fan practice was really just reading and watching the things that they liked, so more consumption. In an older study, but a very influential one, I want to talk a bit about Lamb's work with a second language learner of English who developed his textual skills and also a new textual identity through participation in online fandom. So he was a high school student who was pigeonholed, or I guess we might say, in the position of ESL learner in school. So he wasn't recognized as being an authority in English. And while he was in school, he ended up taking a HTML course and learned how to do a little bit of web design. You can see by the date here, this was earlier web development. And for fun, he decided to create a fan page based on the Japanese performer he really liked. And this is her here, Ryoko Hirosue. And he developed his web page using his skills. But as a result of putting this fan website online, he kind of took part in the international English-speaking fandom around this performer and became known as something of an expert and guru. And he engaged in a great deal of correspondence with other fans in English. So he had a new, through fan practices like this, he developed a new, what Lamb refers to as textual identity. So he was no longer ESL learner, but kind of an expert within this fan space and an international user of English, which was a much more affirming and empowering identity to have than that of student who needs help with his English. But this was something only possible outside the classroom space. Another really interesting study was that done by Kerwood, who's done quite a bit of work with younger learners. She's based in Australia. And this is where she looked at a 13-year-old boy named Jack, who was involved in the Hunger Games fandom. You guys are familiar with the Hunger Games? Mm-hmm. Okay. So a series of young adult dystopian novels. Jack became really involved in the online community for this, and his initial involvement was interacting and debating in online forums. So one of the things that you find is that fans are very passionate about the thing that they love, and they will argue endlessly about it. So what Jack had to do was develop the skills to debate, but also support his position in these online debates with other people who were very well read and perhaps older than him. So he had to develop the ability to kind of cite his sources in his debate. So in a sense, in order to engage in these online discussions, he was developing the same sorts of skills that we often ask our students to do in academic writing classes to support their positions. Beyond that, he then got promoted to become a moderator of the forums. And then over time, he even took on other responsibilities. This specific community also developed its own web-based game. And he became leader of a team of developers and others. So he had an international team that he oversaw. So again, 13-year-old developing a lot of leadership skills on top of that through this fan practice. So going from debating and moderating to leading an international team. Now, closer to home, we're nearby to a community of researchers who are also looking at a really big area of fan practices, and I think it's something that's kind of exciting to see. I'm using the umbrella term amateur translation, but we also, the fan terms and the more appropriate terms are scanlation and fan subbing. So scanlation is the practice of those who like to read graphic novels and manga will translate, so a written textual translation. But you also have fan subbing, which is teams of fans who will subtitle movies and television shows into other languages. So that's a bit more sophisticated. So there are online communities around different programs. There's a really well-known website called wiki.com. I think I've talked about that before. That's a fan subbing community. In any case, research in this area has also looked at the development of intercultural and second language skills here of a Spanish manga fan who engaged in amateur translation, scanlation, of Japanese manga from English into Spanish in an online fan community. And you can see an example of her work taken from this study. But what's really fascinating, this particular fan, I believe her name was Shiro, her English ability was at the A2 level, so it's not extremely high. But her understanding and appreciation for Japanese manga, her access to the community where there are a number of resources that provide support, allowed her to engage in sophisticated translation practices, even though her English wasn't the highest level. I think what she often dealt with at times were finding, as we can see here, idioms and trying to find an equivalent in another language, how to work that out, how to bring it into Spanish and keep what she assumed was the tone initially in Japanese. So she was actually working in 3 languages here. We look across the semiotic resources of 3 languages. So that's pretty cool. Now, the second to last fan practice I want to mention is one that's very near and dear to my heart. This is a photo taken, I don't know if you can tell over here, it's taken in London in 2013. Benedict Cumberbatch is not in the frame, but it was during the filming of the BBC series Sherlock. So that's how I spent my summer vacation one year, running around chasing filming. I was involved in the fan practice of spoiling, which DEFIT defines as the purposeful discovery of crucial developments in the plot of a fictional story, of a film or TV series before that relevant material has been broadcast or released. So this is where we can see how the online fan spaces are allowing for, or enhancing fan practices. The availability of social media and the ability to spread information quickly and kind of crowdsource allows people to speculate, share information, and locate information. And I have a lot more to say about this in other work that I'm doing. Needless to say, I encountered a fan. Her name is Stevie, and I'm working on a case study with her, which I talked a little bit about here in the 2017 article. But she was at filming with me. I met her there in person. She's from Eastern Germany, so she's a highly proficient second language speaker of English. But she engaged in spoiling and getting into these online spaces to develop her English skills with the goal of moving eventually to London. So she was studying at university in Germany, but in her university classes, even though she was studying an English-related subject, all the classes were in German. And she really wanted to move to London, and she had an American style of speaking. So she joined fandom, British-based fandoms, with the purpose of becoming, shifting dialect. So she engaged in a lot of interaction with people. She was involved in a fan podcast around spoiling. But as a result of sharing spoilers, so for example, just to help you figure out, one of the things the fans in the Sherlock Holmes fandom like to do is to try and guess the plot line. This is called playing the game, and it makes sense because if you think about a plot to a movie or story, it's a mystery. And Sherlock Holmes is all about detective stories. So the fans of Sherlock Holmes tend to also like to play detective. And what these fans like to do is try and predict the storyline, or at least predict where filming would happen. If I go back here, you can see there are lots and lots of people, and there were probably several hundred people here this day, which does kind of cause a little bit of a commotion. But fans like to figure out where filming is so then they can watch and guess the story. But the directors of the show don't like to release that information. And sometimes they release false information so that fans don't come, or other fans will release false information because they don't want fans to spoil the show. Okay, so there's a lot of, we might say, fake news in the fandom. And what Stevie had to do was develop the skill of sorting through what was true, what was probable, and what was clearly misleading. So she had to do a lot of fact-checking. So she developed a high degree not only of English competence, where she was able to pick up on humor and idioms and intercultural references specific to British cultural norms, but she also had to be able to like reverse search a lot of things, track down the veracity, and determine credits before, because what could happen is if she posted information that was wrong or misleading, suddenly people will find themselves in the middle of Hampstead Heath at 3 o'clock in the morning because they have the wrong information. You know, so there's certain things she became very aware of, especially because as she started reporting spoilers, her follower count on her Twitter and her Tumblr grew. So I think at one point she was being followed by 60,000 fans. And that's a huge number of people that you can feel responsible to. So for her, spoiling led to the development of certain kinds of critical digital literacy skills in addition to her English skills. And the happy result of that story, I've mentioned this elsewhere, I'll say this again. A couple of years after this ended, she applied for a job that was hiring bilingual German English speakers to work in a media company, and she's now working in London on the South Bank. And her skills are directly transferable. So that's kind of an unusual situation. But now I'm going to take us to the fun stuff, the crux of this talk, and that is the big fan practice known as fan fiction. I have a definition here that was crowdsourced by fans, or among fans by Klink, who's also a fan studies researcher. And this is a humorous definition that one fan provided. Fan fiction is a story written by a person in the fandom because breaking into the creator's office and telling them that everything they did is wrong, and rewriting it is considered rude and illegal. What this gets at is the idea that sometimes fan fiction writing is, it's a kind of audience response, but it can also be something of a transgressive act. It can be aggressively done when you think the story went the wrong way. Have you guys ever been disappointed by a TV show or a movie? Sure, yeah. So fans will fix it. So that's one type of fan fiction. But not all fan fiction is because something is wrong. I like this definition a little bit better by Jameson. It's a bit more open. And she says it's writing that continues, interrupts, reimagines, or just riffs on stories and characters other people have already written about. Sometimes you hear it playing in someone else's sandbox. Things already exist and you play with them a bit more. So fan fiction, actually, of these fan practices that I want to mention, has been the object of quite a bit of research. Just a few studies to point to here. Black is known for her work among English learners in North America mainly, and their use of, so their ESL use of fan fiction to again develop their literacy skills and to transition from novice writers to more proficient writers. So she's done a number of case studies where she's followed students over time, or not students, fans over time, in their writing on the fan archive fanfiction.net. And it's really tremendous where you can see how some writers, they begin as consumers of fan fiction, and then they start writing their first story. And often in a lot of these fan spaces, what you'll see is an opportunity for the fan to leave a note to their audience. On fanfiction.net, this is called the author's notes, and it might be a way of explaining your inspiration or providing other background to your story. But one of her fans took that opportunity as a way to say, please be gentle with me, I'm learning English, I'm developing my English. And what you see over time is the kind of feedback she gets. So fans' stories sometimes elicit a lot of responses, and some of them can be harsh, but often this particular fan was able to negotiate corrective responses where she had support from other fans who told her what she did well, gave her grammar advice, and over time she continued to develop her writing, where after a few years she was writing novel-length fan fiction in English. So that's a tremendous leap in her writing development. And not only that, but she was a Chinese speaker, writing in a Japanese fandom, so she started to foreground her multilingualism. So even though she was writing in English, over time she started to incorporate Chinese and reference to Chinese aspects that drew upon her cultural knowledge and linguistic heritage, but also use of Japanese, and she was also now learning Japanese in school as well. So this was kind of a nice opportunity for her to practice her multilingualism. And speaking of multilingualism, I want to talk about Leppinen's work that's come out of Finland. She and her colleagues have also looked at fan fiction writing among, in particular, young teenage girls there, although not exclusively. And in one of her studies, she looked at the bilingual fan fiction writing practices of young Finnish fans. So this is kind of unique, whereas they're fans of, say, for example, an American English television show, and they write their fan fiction in a mixture of English and Finnish. It might take the situation where I think one of the stories, the writer was imagining herself talking, like in a dream, talking to the character of the show. So the setting and her own thoughts were in Finnish, but when she spoke with the American character of the show, it was in English, because why would he know Finnish? And because it was in her head, she could mix it up. But this was a way, Leppinen argued, of demonstrating bilingualism and global citizenship, that this is a fan who was proficient in English and knowledgeable about another society's media enough to write about it. So these are kind of interesting ways of looking at multilingualism in fan fiction. But what I'm going to talk about is taking what we see fans doing and bringing it into the classroom. So this has been of particular interest to me in Sweden. I was just having a talk with Joan earlier about Sweden being a quirky society. But one of the things that we find is there's a lot of intense media consumption. And I see this in my own students who are training to become secondary school and primary school English teachers, that a lot of them developed their English in online spaces. So some of them have done it through gaming or being in online communities, but quite a few have been fans. And of those have been fans who've actually written fan fiction. So what I've looked at is what fan practices, in particular fan fiction, and how we can possibly develop teaching materials and whether we can bring them into the language classroom and look at the learning that results. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects. They're all the same project, but different iterations of it. And then I'm going to conclude with a new project that's getting started, looking at the secondary school level. So these 3 projects I'm going to talk about are at the university level. So they're the Blogging Hobbit, A Study in Sherlock, and the Potter Project. And then I'll conclude with fan tales. So first off is the Blogging Hobbit, and I think this started with my colleague and I in our teacher education program. The second course our future secondary school teachers have to take is a course on teaching literature and creative writing. So the first course they take is academic writing. So they get blasted with how to write research papers and stuff like that in English. And then immediately they move into literature. But one of the things that we have them do, or have had them do in the past, is do creative writing. But they also need to demonstrate literary analysis, the ability to do literary analysis. So we were looking at fan fiction because it's been argued that fan fiction is a kind of creative literary analysis. And so the Sauro and Sundmark 2016 article, I think that was another one I sent around, was exploring the implementation of this particular project. What we thought we wanted to do was to bridge the teaching of language and literature together through one project, and to have our students engage in a fan fiction activity that could serve as a model for their own teaching in the secondary school. So this is a kind of what we would consider task-based language teaching, task being the writing of the fan fiction. And we selected the kind of fan fiction was based a little bit on my knowledge of the fandom and the text that they had to use. So Björn Sundmark, my colleague in this, he's the literature guy, and he selects different texts each year that the students read in this course that might be books that they would teach. So he also, just some slight disclosure, is a huge fan of Tolkien. He has a dog named Gimli. I don't know if that's significant for you guys. But we were teaching The Hobbit this year, and it coincided with the release of the last 2, this project, with the last 2 of Peter Jackson's Hobbit films. So we thought this is kind of nice because there's some degree of currency in current media that our students might be interested in. So we were looking at what kind of fan fiction have the students do, and because our classes are really large, we have between 80 and 100 students in these classes. So it's hard to say we're going to have 100 pieces of fan fiction. So we actually have them do collaborative fan fiction. And one type of collaborative fan fiction that I had seen online in the Harry Potter fandom is blog-based collaborative role play. And what that is you have a blog, or each person has a blog, but you write from the perspective of your character. And so you'll see people, they'll develop a blog and they'll say, I'm Lily Potter, right? Harry's mom. And I might have some personal entries where it's like what I like going about my day, and I'll select an image to represent me. But then you have a communal blog where you may have like the master player who will start with a plot. And they might say, okay, this is October 25th, 1978 in Hogsmeade, and list the names of the people who are going to be there and maybe start with a paragraph. And then those people who are in that scene will contribute to the story one paragraph at a time. So it's this kind of back and forth role play storytelling that's really good when you have a text with a lot of characters in it. So The Hobbit, like Harry Potter, has a lot of characters. So we decided to use that format and have our students do collaborative blog-based role play, where each group member, and the groups were 3 to 5 approximately. We may have had one team, a couple of teams of 6, but each was to write from the perspective of one character, and they needed to capture the voice and the style of that character. And so if you're familiar with The Hobbit, in addition to The Hobbit, who's this guy over here, you have a lot of dwarves who have different degrees of status. You have other creatures. There's an occasional elf. There's a magician or a wizard. You also have other secondary creatures. And people picked one, and they had to study that character and write from it. And then each was responsible for writing 1,000 words to contribute to their story. And the story had to be a missing moment. So that's another idea of we'll see in fandom, like kind of where the author fades to black. So fill it in, what happened here to those characters. And then in keeping with task-based language teaching, and to help assess their learning, we had them write a reflective paper at the end. So this is something consistent throughout all our projects, where we ask the students, after they've finished their story, to reflect on 2 linguistic factors and choices and 2 literary factors and choices that they attended to in their writing. So this, I'll show you some data about what they pulled out. So it's very interesting to see how much the source material influences what kind of learning there was. So here's what we found, or a variety of things. The students were mostly successful. Again, this is a first-term course, so people are still figuring out whether they want to be teachers. But we had a lot of stories that had riddles or songs in them, because these are featured in Tolkien's writing in The Hobbit. And here's an example from one called The Mirkwood Mysteries. So one student, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this guy, Gollum, but there's a riddle scene in the book, and our students extended that, or they added to it. And what the student who wrote from Gollum's character had to say was, it was really interesting. You had to use a book like it was almost like a dictionary, going back and forth, looking up things. So he really wanted to sound like Gollum. And what he noticed was, when writing his riddle, and when paying attention to Gollum's speech, is that Gollum makes certain kinds of language errors, but he does them systematically. And we can see an example of that here in the last line, "Fool us again and they eats it whole." So this kind of simple subject-verb agreement issue, he wanted to make sure to include that, but his challenge was, to make sure the story and the rhyming was comprehensible while still maintaining an error. So this was pretty sophisticated attention to grammatical form. But most students didn't really attend to the grammar as much as they did the vocabulary. So here's an example of what one of the blogs looked like, and you could see how the story is progressing in nested comments. But one of our students put it this way: "This writing activity has influenced my language skills. During this project, I've been able to expand my repertoire of English words which are not so commonly used in everyday English anymore." And this makes sense. If you go back and you read The Hobbit, the language that Tolkien wrote it in, it's taking place in Middle-earth, a different society from ours, not in the present day. And our students often, regardless of character, they had to pay attention to what kind of words would Tolkien use, so this story sounded like it fit in the book. And they would comment on their specific character's speech style. So there's a particular dwarf who's kind of a leader figure, and he sounds kind of haughty. And so the students noticed, like, at first I wrote this, but then my peers told me, you can't really say that. Your character wouldn't sound, that sounds like a present-day teenager. So they found themselves kind of having to use more, as they termed it, old-fashioned words. In another story, someone was having a party, but they realized they couldn't say, let's have a party. They said, we'll have a feast, right? So again, a shift in formality and we might say lower frequency vocabulary coming up here. These are more unusual words. Now, the other thing that came up as a point was some of the students, we told them all initially during the very first cohort to publish in an online blog. And the following year, when we did it a second time, we had students who were really wanting to do something different. So we gave them the option of publishing in other places. And some of them wanted to publish in online fan fiction communities. So we had some actual fans in our class of The Hobbit, and they're like, yeah, let's put it on a fan fiction site. And some of them did so because they really wanted to get fan responses and fan feedback. And there was one group, a very super eager group called the Dream Team. And that's because this was a dream assignment. They said they would never have this much fun again. They enjoyed it so much. Their story, they were a group of 6, but they asked me once, like, is there an upper word limit? And I said no. My mistake. Their story was 16,000 words long. And they published it in the Fan Fiction Archive of our own, and they spent a lot of time on it. So they were a group of both fans and non-fans. So you had some who were fans, some who were fans of other things, and some who thought fans were crazy, but they were willing to help out. But what they found is that even though they published it in this fan archive, they didn't get any comments. We'll get back to that, but one of the questions was, is it any good? Maybe their story wasn't any good, so maybe they were doing okay for my class, but this wasn't really very good. So I decided to take a look at the fan fiction we were having our students do and compare it to actual fan fiction. So I did a corpus-based study, and this is coming out in Recall, hopefully later this year. And what I did is I created a mini corpus of the learner fan fiction. So we see it was 172,000 words of fan fiction of 31 stories produced by the 2 cohorts in 2013 and 14. They ranged in length from 2,000 to 16,000 words. All of the stories were, I'm saying, rated teen. There was maybe some death and a little bit of violence, but no explicit violence. There was nothing really graphic, and there was no sex. So they were pretty teen rated. Then I'm using fan terms that we'll talk about later in the workshop, meaning these were not romance stories. And they were what's known by fans as canon compliant. We had nobody trying to do something wacky like make the hobbits fly off on the Enterprise with Captain Kirk, right? So there was no mixing of fandoms. And then I went to the fan fiction community archive of our own, and I tried to find similar stories that were published during the same time. So I identified, after removing different stories, I identified 18 stories posted between December 1st, 2013 and January 31st, 2015. So that corresponded with when these stories were published. And this was because my students' writing was influenced by the Hobbit films that were coming out at the time, and so I wanted to keep that equal. If that appeared to influence my students' writing, I wanted stories that were equally influenced. So nothing that came out at a different time. They were similar in length, also rated teen, also no romance, and also no alternate universe or other subgenres. And this is something I will talk about, these subgenres of fan fiction in the workshop later. And I did what's known as a keyword analysis. And so that's a corpus-based analysis where you compare the 2 corpora, and what you're doing is to look and see what kind of words are particularly present in one collection of writing compared to the other. And that's one way of getting at topics, what the focus is. And so what I found, just starting by looking at frequency of content words, in the classroom fan fiction, so what I had my students doing, these were the top 10 content words. And in the fan fiction from online, these were the top 10 words. And we can see in yellow there's quite a bit of overlap in some of them. So we can see certain characters, Thorin, Keely, Bilbo, and Fili, were both highly present and frequently used. We also see say and time. Okay, so these were shared terms. But when I went to the keyword analysis, and so this is a more statistical analysis, what I found was that in the learner fan fiction, these following words were much more frequent than they were in the comparative corpus. Third-person plural pronouns, certain character names, and reference to species, the different kinds of species in the book. Now, looking at the plural pronouns, this made sense because this was collaborative storytelling from multiple characters' perspectives. And most of the fan fiction that's published online is single character based, usually not collaboratively written. So it did make sense that my students would use the we perspective more since they were a collection of writers and a collection of characters. But what we also saw, and I've highlighted in yellow, certain characters were much more frequent in my students' stories than they were in the online fan fiction. Balin, Dori, Bombur. These are 3 dwarves who are not featured dwarves. They aren't like the most famous dwarves. So what we see is that my students actually wrote about more dwarves and less commonly referenced dwarves than the online fan fiction. You can do a negative keyword analysis, so that's kind of like looking at the opposite. What is particularly infrequent in my students' fan fiction compared to the online fan fiction? And so, not a surprise, third-person singular pronouns, kinship terms, other character names, and contracted forms. Taking a look at what those were, this made sense, and I want to, the singular pronouns, again, that's kind of the flip side of the plural pronouns. But the character names I've highlighted here in yellow are different species. From my students' reference to dwarves, these are all elves. And in fact, one of the elves isn't a character created by Tolkien at all. She was created, this character here, for the films, the Peter Jackson films, because those books have very few female characters in them. And the contracted forms were found not just in speech, but maybe more casual writing style, casual speech. So my students actually use slightly more formal language from that indicator. So these were some differences. But I also went to the Dream Team to get their input on what they thought happened. Remember, these were also fans, and some of whom were really big fans. This is Bee, and she identified herself as a fan since the beginning of time. And she thought the reason why their story didn't elicit a lot of response is because it didn't really do what fan fiction does. And she says, fanfics that get really popular kind of answer to some kind of fantasy that people have about the characters, or something they really want to explore, or they create an alternate universe. We didn't have anything like that. I mean, I think ours was very, very much like the book in a way, so maybe it wasn't as exciting as some other fan fiction because it wasn't innovating in that way. So we thought, this is a good point. We need to revise this. But we got other feedback from students, and the next one was also pretty telling, who had something else to say about maybe why another way the fan fiction assignment wasn't working. She said, I felt it unfair to work with The Hobbit on such a project, since a big part was to connect with a character from the book and write from that perspective. To choose a book with absolutely no women at all made me not wanting to take neither Tolkien nor this assignment to heart. So we actually had students who had to find interesting ways to write female characters. We had one story that was written all about the spiders. So there's a bunch of spiders that are encountered along the way, and in order to reproduce, some of them have to be female. So that's what happened. We had students writing from the perspective of very minor characters who were female. And this particular student had wanted to be a queen, and she's like, hey, fantasy, I get to be a queen. But there are no queens in The Hobbit. So she had to settle for this guy. He's kind of an elf king, but not as good as a queen. So she was very dissatisfied. So we saw that we were perhaps not giving our students the kind of flexibility that is found in actual fan fiction. So this led us to our second project, a study in Sherlock. We decided to change things. And this time we went from my colleagues' fandom to my fandom, since I was a fan. And we were also looking at, seriously, the information our students had given us, but that's also been characterized in research on fan practices. Now this is coming out of a position paper by Thomas and Stornayo, who talk about the idea of restorying, and they apply it to fan works. They talk in particular about fan art. Now we restory things all the time. As researchers who collect, for example, data from multiple participants who all tell us a story, their perspective, we have to rewrite it and restory it ourselves. But what Thomas and Stornayo found is that young readers do things with the stories they read. They imagine themselves into the stories. They reimagine the very stories themselves, as people of all ages collectively reimagine time, place, perspective, mode, meta-narrative, and identity through retold stories. So we get back to that idea of fan fiction is playing in someone else's sandbox, playing with the characters someone else has written about. And we find that this is what fans do. There are a lot of different ways of restoring, where I'll talk a little bit about some of them. Alternate universe, again, as they describe Spider-Man in the Star Trek world, or bending, and they use the terms race bending or queer bending characters. Or sometimes you see the term gender bending or cis swapping used when you're changing the sex of the characters. So there are a lot of different ways fans will play with that reality. And we weren't letting our students do that. We weren't letting them innovate, as Bea had said. So I just want to point to some work that's come out in the popular press that's talked about how fans do this. So here's an example from an article, newspaper article, called What a Race-Bent Hermione Granger Really Represents, and how fans may approach a text and play with it. Race-bent characters have long been making appearances on sites like Tumblr, but they've been picking up heat recently. One of the most popular and frequent, at least on my dash, Hermione Granger is a woman of color, most often black. So you'll see fans have been for a while debating, we never really hear what Hermione looks like. We know that she has bushy hair. She seems to have brown eyes, and we know at some point, until she gets them corrected, she has buck teeth. But aside from that, and aside from the casting of Emma Watson in the Harry Potter films, it's pretty open. So fans, this is some fan art that we see, have been race-bending Hermione in their art. And interestingly, sometimes what fans do predicts or influences what we see in the general media. And this is what is, again, a continuation of the casting of Hermione in the play Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. She was a woman of color here. And as a reader and writer and a fan, this author had this to say: if you want to make a human being into a monster, deny them at the cultural level any reflection of themselves. And growing up, I felt like a monster in some ways. I didn't see myself reflected at all. And I took that to heart when I think about what my own student was saying, not taking Tolkien to heart, because she wasn't reflected in it. So with a study in Sherlock, we gave our students that option. So instead of forcing them into one mold, we gave them a bit more variety. And in fact, we really encouraged them to innovate. And we talked about race bending, gender bending, and cis swapping in the classroom, and pointed to media where we see that already being done. And Sherlock Holmes is a great example to use because there's so many different versions of these stories, where we see now, for example, the elementary version coming out of the United States has done both race bending and gender bending of one of the characters. So instead of John Watson, we have Joan Watson as an Asian American woman and not just a British male. So we asked our students in these stories, instead of doing a missing moment, they were going to do what's known as case fic, or mystery telling, since that fits within the Holmes stories. And they had two choices: either retell a Sherlock Holmes mystery or tell an original mystery, but in an alternate universe. And we can say, for example, the show that I'm a fan of, Sherlock, does exactly that. It retells a lot of the Holmes stories, but sets them in 21st century London. So it's time shifted. That's an alternate universe. Or they could, if they wanted to, be more traditional and tell an original Sherlock Holmes mystery in the original context. So we let them choose. And we let them be a lot more flexible in what ways they could alternate the universe, including at the character level. And so what we found is quite a few stories took place in Sweden. So what students did is they transported Holmes and Watson to the Swedish countryside or even to Mälmo itself. So here's one, The Hound of the Northern Lights, which is a retelling of The Hound of the Baskervilles, but set in Norrland. So we get the northern lights up there. And in the story, the authors have to grapple with how do Holmes and Watson make sense of life in Sweden and dealing with the Swedish police and eating and drinking Swedish food, that sort of thing. So they got to kind of make it a bit their own. Closer to home, in 2016, we had quite a few stories that were actually situated in Mälmo, and some of them were dealing with particular local issues. So over here on the right, we've got a study in graffiti, which is dealing with, this was by a group of students who are not just training to be English teachers, that's their second subject. Their first subject is art. So they combined their training in art and illustrated their story. So that's their own illustration. But another one we have is a study in brown, also set in Mälmo, but they envision Holmes and Watson as secondary school students, reading about a crime carried out locally that represents racial tension. And we can see here a quote from the story. "See here," Sherlock said, pointing to the small screen. "I've had a Google alert set up for these certain phrases ever since I took a small interest in the Miss Farsi case relating to racial violence in the Mälmo area. Islamophobiacs who fear everyone and everything they can't buy at Ullered," scoffed John. "Yes, well, not quite," replied Sherlock. "The people behind the avatars on this particular site is not your average uneducated riffraff pointing fingers at anyone who doesn't share their love of meatballs." So I don't know if you're familiar with Ullered. You're probably familiar with Swedish meatballs. Ullered is a really big store in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of like giant Walmart that a lot of Swedes will go to. So they're making reference to racial tensions found in Mälmo, but they've twisted the story. You could see A Study in Brown is a play on A Study in Scarlet, as was A Study in Graffiti. So this is a retelling where they situate it in the local context and address social concerns that are relevant to our students and their own future pupils. Others did more imaginative things. For example, The Missing Case explored who shot JFK. And we can see here, obviously, Oswald was not the murderer. As it turns out, in their story, it was Moriarty who did it. But one of my favorites was when this happened. And so this is from the story called Nowhere to Hide. Hyde spelled Hyde, as in Jekyll and Hyde. And this student had this to say: "My interest in Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes world is still at an intermediate level. On the other hand, my knowledge of the Scooby-Doo universe is far greater, and I could enter that verse much easier than the universe of Sherlock Holmes." So Scooby-Doo served as a gateway to their mystery telling, and what they ended up doing was try to imagine what would happen if John and Sherlock, as teenagers, were part of the Scooby Gang. So they had to situate and try and merge these two universes, so somehow maintain elements of the characters Holmes and Watson, but make them fit in with like a 1960s American crime-solving group like this. And so that was kind of a fun way, but also a challenging way to try and merge those environments. I mentioned before that the text that these are based on really does kind of influence the language features and the literary features that the students attend to. And we can see this when we look at the reflections that came out of A Study in Sherlock and compare them to The Blogging Hobbit. Often issues like this came up. So one student said, instead of saying he said, we and Doyle instead used said he. So we could see word order difference when it comes to introducing quoted phrases. Second, we and Doyle often, from Watson's perspective, referred to Sherlock Holmes as my colleague, and from Sherlock's perspective, referring to Watson as my friend. Doyle's Sherlock Holmes often said pray instead of please, and I fancy instead of I believe, which we also used in our fan fiction. So these are very different kinds of features of language that my students, although proficient in English, they don't use. And again, it's kind of capturing some of the style, maybe an older style. But this was also very commonly referenced because a lot of our students not only read the Holmes stories, but they also consulted other media, including the BBC television show, of which a number were or became fans. And one student had this to say: "First off, I'm highly Americanized in my English use, and I blame Hollywood. It has been a welcome challenge to write in British. My biggest inspiration has once again been the BBC show. I truly enjoyed using the word foggiest in a text, and it's now part of my vocabulary. My American is being invaded, the British are coming." Okay, so that was very cute. But this was actually something that was referenced quite a bit, and not at all in The Hobbit. So in the Study in Sherlock, quite a few students identified incorporating and learning what they recognized as British English, whereas their normal type of English is more Americanized. Okay, the third and last of these projects that we've done is the Potter Project. We had a lot of students who said, yes, Sherlock Holmes is great, so is The Hobbit, but we want to do Harry Potter, because that's what we grew up reading. So we transitioned to the Potter Project this year, and this time we actually gave our students 4 options. And this was based upon diving deeply into not only what was successful before, but looking at online fan fiction to see and find examples of stories that we could use for our own students. And we came up with, again, this is still collaborative storytelling, but we gave them 4 different genres or prompts to choose from. Alternate point of view, for example, Draco Malfoy and the Philosopher's Stone. Prequel or sequel, something set before or after. It's not over until I say it's over. Missing moments, Meanwhile in Hufflepuff House. And alternate universe, When Harry Met Pippi, Longstocking, of course. So students were allowed to pick one of these or kind of a mixture. And because we had, again, the Harry Potter books, there are 7, and we weren't having time for them to read all of them. So if their group happened to be very well versed in the Harry Potterverse, they could write their story based on any of the 7. And in the class, we actually only read the first one. So those who were reading Harry Potter for the first time, which very few were in that position, but they would base it only on that first book. So we tried to limit the range while giving them room to be flexible. And there were a lot of really innovative stories that came out of this. We had quite a few alternate point of view, especially from the teacher's perspective, which makes sense when we think about we're training teachers. So this was the curious case of Quirinus Quirrell, who follows Quirrell through Harry's first year. Just vignettes, not the full book, of course. And this is actually the very final moments of the book. And you can see in yellow, the pain hit him like the Hogwarts Express, and then there was nothingness. That's how their story ended. So telling that perspective, what's it like from Quirrell? Students had this to say about what they learned as a result. And again, here, this was quite interesting. I mentioned before that they started off with academic writing, and now they're doing creative writing. And they were able to make connections and differences this way. We had quite a few who talked about learning punctuation usage. I thought that was quite interesting. This project made me pay attention to grammatical aspects in the Harry Potter books. For example, Rowling doesn't use a lot of transitional words, which we just use a lot in academic writing, but rather she uses colons. I have never used colons before in my writing, so that was fun to learn. We had a number of people talk about her use of dashes or semicolons or sentence structure and length, and how over time they observed that her sentences got longer and more complex as Harry got older. So this was quite interesting, as we'd never had people talk about the mechanics of writing to this degree. Here was another student. The next thing was to try to mimic Rowling's version of Hagrid's dialect. For example, he doesn't say for, he says fur. There's no alteration to the language or the spelling or the language when anyone else speaks in the book. It's only with Hagrid. There were quite a few students who focused on the first book, where Hagrid has quite a large role, and they wrote from Hagrid's perspective. There were a number of that. And so for them, there was an interesting attempt to capture that dialect, which is really challenging. So we're continuing to look at that, but it was received with, I think it was received well, but you can see here how each story kind of elicits a different kind of focus. And the way I want to conclude is by talking about a new project that started. This is a European project called Fan Tales. And this is a project, as we described, it leverages practices from fan fiction, interactive fiction, or a form of non-linear narrative that verges on the world of gaming. You guys know choose your own adventure stories. Like you come to a room, there's 3 doors. Which one do you go through? Go to door 1, you turn to page 27, door 2, page 54. Well, you see in gaming, interactive gaming, there's a lot of storytelling like that, so that's an aspect. And multilingualism to deliver technology-mediated storytelling tasks to the European language classroom and beyond. So this team, we're in Sweden, Belgium, and Germany. We're working with secondary schools to develop teaching materials, to test them out in the secondary school classroom, to support this kind of fan fiction-based interactive storytelling that also supports multilingualism. So going back to that example where I was saying, our partner in this, Judith Bunkens-Kosten, argues, life is not monolingual. And you can find in a lot of the stories we read instances where there are other languages encountered. And we don't need to hide that from our stories. I'm just going to go back to the Sherlock. Up here in the corner, the artwork, Rache, which is, in German, it means revenge. But that's a feature of an actual Conan Doyle story where someone is trying to figure out what some dying person wrote with their finger. And there's an argument that it's perhaps the name Rachel, when in fact it was revenge, it was German. So we see that Holmes has some knowledge of German. There's also the Greek interpreter, where there's a whole story about a Greek interpreter who has been kidnapped. So what we're doing is trying to draw upon not just the languages of the communities and schools or the target languages that our pupils are learning, but also the home languages, their mother tongues that they bring to the classroom and allow that to fit into the storytelling. So that it doesn't have to be in English class, you use only English. So we're developing materials to feature English plus, Swedish plus, German plus, and Dutch plus. So we're starting with English, but then we're going to be moving into these other languages. So we're still in the initial stages with that, but we're going to have some of our materials ready, I would say by August. We'll see what that looks like. And I can say more about that later. But if you're interested in the art, I'd like to give a bit of a nod to the fan artists who included their art here. Foxa Staccato, Mudblood 428, and Penn's Woods. And thank you.
I was only wondering, so how are the students being evaluated finally in the class? What are the criteria
So I actually have the teaching materials online, and for the Potter project, you can see the rubric. You can find that, I think you can find it on my academia.edu page. But what we have is a rubric where we evaluate, we've got 4 criteria, 2 that deal with the storytelling. So my colleague Bjorn looks at the stories for illustrations of specific literary features that they may have talked about in the literary analysis portion of the course. So this is a course that we co-teach. There are multiple teachers in it. And he also reads the stories for cohesion. So that's another issue that comes up where you can have people writing the stories where they don't fit together well. So they finish it, but it's not a cohesive story. It feels like joint or separate parts that don't fit together. So we look at that to demonstrate the literary competence. And then we have 2 other categories that look at linguistic competence and application to teaching, where we look at their reflection portfolio, where they have to talk about, we ask them to identify, you saw the examples here, at least 2 features of each and give examples and explain their thinking behind it. And then they also have to talk about how such an activity, like we've done here, how they might use it in their own classroom and how that can support the development of speaking, reading, writing, and listening. And so, again, it's a very straightforward rubric, but each of those criteria aligns with the criteria for the course. So all 4 of those are the course goals.
Do your students use some technology to collaborate, some specific platforms? And also, did they talk about how collaboration helped them or not helped them?
So a lot of our students will use Google Docs, and they'll do a lot of their composing in Google Docs, and they're all required to publish online, so either in a blog or some fan space. And we have about like a third every year who will post it on Archive of Our Own, for example. But the composition is usually in a collaborative document. And sometimes they will meet in person together to write, but often what they'll do is they will write in the shared document, and they'll take turns as they come in to edit and smooth over. And the really successful groups do that well, and that leads to learning, because then they become aware of, this is why that doesn't fit here, I see what you did there, and there's that track changes record. But we do have groups that really struggle, and this is something that we're going to have to work a lot harder with. We had a lot of conflict this year. Some of it is just people who are, the group self-select, and often they don't know who works, they don't know each other's work style that well. And so sometimes you have groups that implode and then split into two smaller groups because they can't agree on the plot. And then you have some people who just phone it in and let the other people do all the work, much to the resentment of those individuals. And you have some people who decide in the middle of the term that teaching isn't for them, and so they just kind of disappear and don't let the rest of their group know. So it is mostly successful, but it's also really frustrating, but we want it to be.